If it passes, print that.
Hello, Ways and Means. Here again, today, May 7th.
Yes, it is.
I don't, Mark's not here, so it's hard to know. We are continuing our work on S-127. And we are going to start our testimony with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, who were kind enough to join us this afternoon, given how tight things were this morning. And then we are going to hear from Chris Donnelly from Champlain Housing Trust with some capital stack scenarios for us. And then we are going to have staff join us to talk about some possible ways to add some guardrails on this. So with that, Samantha, would you like to join us? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me back. Thought I joined already. For the record, my name is Samantha Sheehan. I'm the Municipal Policy and Advocacy Specialist for the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and happy to be back so soon to continue discussing CHIP as proposed in S-27. Josh has been called away to defend municipal public rights of way next door. But may come help.
I think we're in good hands.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, great. So I love an agenda. I recognize that you've heard such a wealth of testimony. So here are my goals today. First, to quickly just remind you of a long 4 days ago, what the sort of primary motivations are for municipal governments in asking for CHIP to come into existence. And then in the spirit of continuous improvement,
Thank you.
I listened back to my most recent testimony, and I realized I may have totally confused a really important point on the process of revaluation during a CHIP. So we're going to review that quickly. And then I'm happy to talk about the municipal processes that happen prior to conceiving of a CHIP development, and specifically in preparation to go for VEPC approval and take action to create a housing development site under the proposed program. And then lastly, we're going to talk about who can use CHIP.
And then if we could squeeze in, I would say it would probably be 4A or a new 5. Once a municipality has entered into these contracts with a developer, how a municipality's capacity, capability, interest, concerns about managing that contract.
Okay, and if I forget, remind me.
Maybe.
Okay, great. So as a reminder, this is like a 1-page summary of my last round of testimony. So it is a top priority of VLCT in this biennium to realize a new authority for municipal government to have tax increment financing for projects. So project-based TIF. The proposal before you, which we enthusiastically support, is called CHIP, the Community Housing Infrastructure Program. The reasons why are because the equalized grand list growth is projected by GFO next year to be 14%. That is a rapid rate of growth that damages affordability for everyday Vermonters and is driven by market factors which are largely beyond a municipality's control. The real annual grand list growth from all types of development is much more like 0.8% to 3%. Specifically, we know from VHFA's most recent research that the portion of that up to 3% growth on the grand list that comes from housing is less than 0.5% annually statewide. So this is to say the numbers show that it is extraordinarily difficult and increasingly difficult for municipalities to spur the housing that they have envisioned, that they need, and that they allow for in local bylaw. Why we are so enthusiastic about CHIP is because it does not rely on a state appropriation scheme such as grants or tax credits, which exist and are productive, but are we need more, as I think best demonstrated by the Smart Growth America analysis. Because CHIP does not require an increase in municipal tax rates. So remember, municipalities do now have the option to go to bond. That requires a 2/3 vote. These are difficult times for municipal budgets, and that's a difficult vote to get. And CHIP does grow other non-property state and local revenues, everything from parking to meals and rooms. And CHIP does sustainably over time increase state and local tax capacity by growing the grand list through new housing. So that's my summary statement on our enthusiasm for CHIP. So here's my redo. So you remember the story of the 10-acre parcel with a single family home and how through actions and policies created at the state and local level, we can add value to that 10-acre parcel. What I realized maybe I did not make clear is that at each stage of this improvement to the parcel, the municipal lister or appraiser, as appropriate in that town, will revalue the property. And that new investment or improvement to the property will be reflected in an increased value on the grand list every year on or before April 1st. Then, when the improvements are done and no more improvements have been made, then that property is treated just like all their neighbors. And that revaluation will happen through the normal systems that you're very familiar with, the CLA, if there was not a reappraisal, or a reappraisal if it is the year to conduct that municipal wide. So what happens to the tax increment during this period of investment or improvement on the parcel is that, so for the sake of argument, back to my mouse here. So for the sake of argument, I'm calling this point of subdivision and property transfer pre-CHIP. And then the point of public infrastructure investment, the start of CHIP, right? So pre-CHIP, I did have lunch, but hadn't like soaked in yet. So pre-CHIP, the new valuation after the property transfer on the grand list, so we go from 1 property to 5, that would create the original taxable value in the 4 contiguous parcels that we're going to use for CHIP. Then the municipality gets an improved CHIP program and they begin to construct public improvements such as sewer, transportation, recreation, drinking water. That adds value to that property without new structures on it. The municipal lister will assess that new value and that will be reflected on the grand list. This is when the increment begins. So if this is a market rate development as proposed now, that would mean the original taxable value goes to the ed fund, 30% of this new taxable value goes to the ed fund, the remainder 70% of the state increment goes to paying for that infrastructure that has already been built. Then to kind of make this even more illustrative of what is likely to happen in real life at the town level, we'll say it's going to take 2 full fiscal years for the developer to build these 4 houses. So the lister will go out to the property on a date before April 1st and will assess how much of the final construction is complete at that date. So if it's 50% of the total construction that is permitted on site, then the lister will record a property value that is 50% of the projected final value. Then we call the project complete. No further improvements have been made. There is a new appraised value as determined by the municipal lister or appraiser. Then this property behaves sort of normally on the grand list, of course, with one dramatic exception, which is the new incremental revenue is contained by the CHIP program. But those increases every year in the increment do increase the dollar amount to the ed fund because of that 30% increment contribution over the original taxable value. Just in case you find this testimony untrustworthy, I found a card.
And it's not about the testimony being
Yeah.
trustworthy or untrustworthy. It's
Sure.
that we have an obligation to like listen to when we're talking about like basic mechanics of something like this or numbers.
Yeah,
We need to listen to our joint fiscal office first and the Department of Taxes and sort of other folks in the room.
sure. Sure. So I pulled a lister's card for a multi-year development that was the result of a subdivision. So in 2021, on April 1st, the city of Burlington certified its grand list post municipal wide reappraisal. At that time, this parcel 125 Cambrian Way did not exist. In July, that property was subdivided and then transferred, sold to a new developer. And it appears for the first time on the grand list in 2022. That land value, because this is between appraisal periods, that land value you see every year stays the same, 3.4 million. So that first year, the total appraised value is this yellow box, 3.4 million. Then in subsequent years, during the construction of this new 32-unit condo building, the appraisers would go out, assess the level of completion of the permitted project, and then account for that appropriately on the city's grand list. So we see it go from 3.4 to 4.6 to 8. And then finally, after the date that construction is complete and the rental inspection has passed and folks are able to move into new condos, the current appraised value is 15.1. So this is an 11 million something, 11.7 million increase in the taxable value of this parcel over the period of the construction. This is not TIF. This is not in a TIF. Okay. So now we're going to move to item number 3 on the agenda, which is talking about the municipal processes that would happen prior to endeavoring a CHIP development. So before getting there, there will be years of public process that are actually required by state law and are used to determine the types of housing that are needed, envisioned, and will be allowed for in local bylaw. So this starts with the municipal plan. I would ask, as we move through talking about municipal processes, keep in mind that various parts of state law require quite robust public and democratic processes, as well as a very healthy amount of transparency for the public, primarily through public records law and open meeting law. So each individual action and authority that the municipal body takes has a very public record of warning, notice, deliberation, and action. And each of those 4 steps creates an opportunity for the public to engage. So this is absolutely true with the development of a municipal plan, which typically starts with a citizen body that develops a municipal plan. That goes to the select board for discussion, potentially amendment. The select board adopts it. Then it is required by statute to be shared with other interested parties, up to and including DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. And each of these steps requires its own public hearing and then a vote of the body. What is within the municipal plan is also prescribed in state law. The process for designated areas is quite similar. I won't repeat it. Basically the same. Except that that also requires agency staff review and then has to be approved by a state board, which used to be called the Downtown Development Board, and as of Act 181 is called the Community Investment Board. Act 181 also changed the future processes for determining these growth centers. I think you're all familiar with them, so I won't go through, but here's a sort of recap of how the tiers are mapped and by whom. Then a town may or may not, they have the authority if they so choose, to create zoning bylaw as a way of enforcing the vision of the plan. So the plan is the community-wide vision. It's taken years to develop. It is approved by the appropriate state oversight. And then how do we make the plan become things and buildings? And that is done through bylaw. The creation of bylaw goes through very much the same process, starts at the citizen commission, is drafted, is voted, is referred to the legislative body, is deliberated. Each amendment as proposed requires a public hearing and a vote. And then the bylaws are noticed, also shared with those statutory groups, including neighboring municipalities, the Regional Planning Commission, DHCD, and others. And at a minimum, there must be a published public report, one public hearing, and a 15-day notice period for public comment. Many municipalities have their own local rule, either by ordinance or charter, that doubles or triples that amount of public process before the adoption of a bylaw by their own sort of, they put that burden on themselves to do that. So then we have the rules for how things get built at the local level. Next, we need to identify the needs. What are the true needs of the community? None of the items or examples on this list are required by state law, but they're very typical, especially if you are going to ask for financing authority or a budget expenditure. The municipality would work really hard, the administration, the town manager, the mayor, as well as the legislative body, to justify that financing and expenditure to the best extent possible. So they may do feasibility studies, housing needs assessments, all sorts of types of community outreach. When we were doing neighborhood code, when I worked at Burlington, we did missing middle bingo nights at Burlington Beer Company. So like all sorts of informal and formal public outreach and process, technical and financial planning, etc. If the municipality is contemplating using municipally owned land, there would be a whole nother process for putting out RFPs and what's it called? Request for information, RFIs. They wouldn't just like pick the first developer that knocked on the door as a partner. They would go through an additional public process to vet the best potential developer, which would meet the needs of the municipal plan, the zoning and bylaw, and this public outreach process. That's very typical. I need to grab a beverage. Sorry. I was thinking someone's gonna make a montage of me opening seltzers on the record.
Who do you think will do that?
I don't know, hopefully someone nice. Okay. So that's everything that happens before we even think, hey, maybe we could go for a chip here. So now the legislative body needs to contemplate and then take action to get the town to a chip VETSI approval process or VETSI application. As I mentioned, each action, each authority, delegation of work, hiring of a technical assistance firm or consultant, expenditure of pre-development funds, each of those steps require an action of the local legislative body. That deliberation, that would be noticed. There would be information posted online. All public records planning that would be available by public records request. There would be public hearing and public comment at the select board meeting. And then the vote would of course be done in public. So those steps, the sort of pre-development, pre-chip steps, are first to create a site. So to identify a site, a project, a developer, and then possibly a fiscal sponsor if that sponsor will not be the municipality itself or the developer. Probably concurrently with this, the municipality is also building a technical assistance team. So this could be real estate developers, definitely at least one attorney that specializes in development and land use law and permit defense, environmental engineering, if they're going to be undertaking something like a stormwater component for the public improvement, transportation engineers, if there's a transportation component, you get the idea. So they're acquiring that technical support team. And then that technical support team assists the following steps, which include scoping, project readiness, such as acquiring development financing, which may need to be done through a grant or a bond, and then drafting the agreement. What I hope you take away from my testimony today is that the housing infrastructure agreement, as it's called in S-127, is vitally important to the municipal interest in the CHIP program. This is like the golden ticket for the CHIP that protects the public interest and the interests of the municipal corporate.
So name of that again?
Housing infrastructure agreement.
I got the gold there.
Yeah, we could rename it. You love naming stuff, right? On
that duty when requested.
okay. So the S-127 does not invent this concept. These absolutely exist and have been used productively by municipalities of all shapes and sizes to sue developers in the past. And so that's the point of this agreement. If the developer fails at any point in the life of the CHIP development to meet its obligations as conceived through this very robust public process, then that agreement is the sort of right of action, provides the right of action for the municipality to get remedy. And then they execute the agreement, again, requires authorization by the legislative body. That is all done out in the sunshine, in front of the town and with town input. And then they prepare their VETSI submission. I did not plan to walk through the VETSI submission because I think that.
I think VETSI can do that. Yeah.
And VETSI do that, yeah, great. So just to review. So we start some years ago with a perennial process for planning and zoning.
Do you use PowerPoint clip art or a different?
PowerPoint clip art.
It's really like fairly nice clip art that you use.
I
Generous.
do my best to curate from within the PowerPoint clip art. Thank you.
I'm sorry, and we're taking questions at the end.
Okay. I go for the hip flips. So we start with planning and zoning, and then that's perennial, right? We're always doing that. We're always updating. We're looking to reform. We're looking to adapt to the needs of the community and our local bylaw. Then we have a community process and feedback loop, missing middle bingo and the such. Then we enter the sort of hard tack pre-development period that includes spending money and acquiring money to pay for that early design and necessary permit acquisition. Then we sign the infrastructure agreement. So we've locked in our development partner, we've locked in our fiscal sponsor, we have obligated appropriately who will be doing what and on what timeline. Then we go to VEPSI approval. Assuming we've done this very well and this is a great project and we receive VEPSI approval, that unlocks a new step that we haven't discussed yet, which is both the municipality and the developer in the most likely scenario will now start the real work of making this project possible in developing the funding stack as needed. And there is likely to be a municipal side funding stack and a private nonprofit side development stack, and getting the permits that are necessary, state and local permits. These happen in a logical way. These happen like this. And at the end, if the developer needs conventional financing, they absolutely have to have those permits in place to get conventional financing. Then we get to build the public improvements. I will say what would really happen in real life, the subterranean public improvements would happen first. What is the opposite of subterranean? The terranean improvements of the housing would happen second. The surface improvements of the housing would happen second. And then third would be the surface improvements. So the rain gardens, the shade trees, the protected bike lanes, curbing, whatever. And then, so I'll go to 0.5A. So over the life of the chip. Okay. So while the chip is being built, there's a lot to do. So assuming that the municipality has municipal permitting, which is definitely true if they're tier 1A, they're having to issue and enforce permits, a lot of them, electrical permits, weatherization permits, rental permits, site preparation permits, all sorts of things. They are managing the money. If there are grants and tax credits, they have an additional obligation for any number of compliance requirements unrelated to the CHIP compliance that they're doing. They are revaluing that property in a timely and fair way in order to generate the increment that's paying for these improvements. They are reporting to VEPSI as required, in whatever way you decide to make them do that in this bill. And that's a lot. And then they're managing the real impacts of having a construction project in the middle of their town. There may be, traffic diversion. They may need a law enforcement solution if they're one of the majority of municipalities that don't have law enforcement. For traffic control, they may be running economic development programs if this has shut down Main Street, so on. That's a busy time, absolutely, when you're taking on a big construction project, public-private construction project. Then once the construction period is complete and the final improvements have been made and the increment is sort of, the increment and valuation process has sort of returned to normal municipal processes, there's much less to do. For the duration of the debt service period, municipalities service debt like all the time. So that's totally normal. And the auditing, also municipalities have to have a town audit. Every municipality has to have an audit every year. Auditing is also quite normal and within every municipality's general ability and existing resources. So this is a great natural segue to who can use CHIP. So the simplest way I have found to illustrate this is every city and town in Vermont can use CHIP, but not in every part of the city or town. That is because of practical impossibilities. That is because of the specific requirement as drafted in S-127 for eligibility. And that is because of the municipality's own self-imposed bylaw, zoning and bylaw. CHIP will help communities build the type of housing that they need, put it where they want it to be, and build at a density that is appropriate for that community. CHIP is housing type agnostic, and this is a really important to preserve element of the program, because in order to meet this need of 36,000 to 40,000 homes in 5 years, we need housing type agnostic policy. We need to support the use of manufactured homes. We need to build mobile home parks. We need to help homeowners convert single family homes to duplexes and triplexes. We need to convert existing commercial property to multifamily homes. We need to build new market rate multifamily homes. We need student housing. You get the point. The list goes on. We need all of it. And in some municipalities, the need for student housing may be very acute, and that's a priority. In another community, the need for supportive housing for aging Vermonters may be more acute and more of a priority. CHIP will help those towns tackle their priorities as they've determined through these very long public processes as I've described them. I also want to pause there and say that to the concern that has been shared by many about the possibility of foregone revenues, that developments would have happened anyway, and now CHIP is being leveraged or potentially abused for a project that would have happened without it. I think your best protection against foregone revenue is this robust, mandatory public process that happens at the municipal level. And remember that municipalities have skin in the game. We are forfeiting a greater portion of our increment for the project, the municipality is, and up to 100% of the increment at the local level. If the municipality has gone through years of planning, years of building designated areas, years of planning commission meetings to fight over a word in a bylaw, multiple public hearings, multiple town votes, multiple expenditures, authorizations, appropriations for pre-development. They've gone through community outreach, town halls, bingo nights, site visits. They have a really good idea of how attractive this priority site for development is and who that's attractive to. If there is an interested developer ready to build, they are not going to keep going and keep putting out municipal expenses and keep resourcing the work towards VEPC approval just to give up their own tax revenue for a project that doesn't need it, is my argument. There are two things that are really important here for communities like mine and Hancock to be able to use CHIP to build the housing that they need. One of those provisions is the ability for the developer to acquire the debt. This really helps towns with little to no bonding capacity. I'm not sure if you read the recent Digger article about the flood impacts. Middlesex has spent its reserves and is carrying $4 million in debt from the 2024 flood, and they are not alone. I think Ludlow's over $7 million. Sutton still has double its annual budget out in FEMA reimbursement it's waiting for. Cash flow is a problem in normal times. Cash flow is a big problem for flood impacted towns. So that ability for the developer or a partner such as the BHFA, the bond bank, other future fiscal partners to take on that bonding capacity is really important for small, low resource towns that rely mostly on property taxes for their general fund. It reserves their bonding capacity for emergency, for a future flood, if they need to do emergency borrowing, and it reserves the cash reserves that they have on hand for emergency. The second thing that's really important for rural communities is the ability to extend the municipal increment on the technical support. Municipalities will not do this. Select boards will not do this if it's their volunteer time that has to develop the CHIP project. And they understand the risk of doing that. So they're going to want the right attorney, they're going to want the right real estate advisor, they're going to want the right economic development consultant, the right engineer, the list goes on their team helping them do this. And they will use the existing technical assistance programs like that VLCT offers and the RTCs and others through MTAP and other programs. But they're going to need professional, dedicated help through a consultant agreement. Oh, the grand finale, I forgot. So CHIP is innovative and effective, and so are we. The we here is municipal officials. So I want to make sure you understand that the component parts of CHIP, as we walked through the planning, the zoning, the building a designated area, the pre-development work, the contractual obligations to the developer, the engagement with VEPC and other state agencies, the permit acquisition, the permit management, the audits that are required, the reporting and compliance that's required. This is all the regular daily work, Monday through Friday, well, Sunday through Sunday of municipal government. This is well within our wheelhouse. It is ambitious for a lot of towns to endeavor to do all together. But the component parts are not foreign or outside of the expertise of a town administration. And lastly, I want to say small towns that were struggling before because of the housing crisis and other reasons are doing really hard redevelopment projects right now without the architecture of a state program and without a financing tool as sophisticated as this. So we have Plainfield in a really extreme flood retreat. We have Barry with severe grand list damage from flood sale. We have Rochester, which years ago closed its high school and is navigating a community-wide revisioning for the productive use of their vacant high school, which is far and away the largest asset in the town. And by the way, they're paying to keep the pipes from freezing out of the town budget. We have Burlington, which created a day shelter at the height of the pandemic that now serves over 200 unsheltered Vermonters every day for food and basic needs. We have communities like Brattleboro, Ludlow, Barry again, Sutton, Johnsbury, Middlesex, Moortown, that have a serious budget problem right now. They are really struggling to deliver the basic functions that they are obligated to by state law and that their constituents expect from town government. And they're really struggling to pay for that and to deliver the quality of service that I think we all feel Vermonters expect and deserve. So these are big challenges that town governments are facing. They are absolutely up to the task. CHIP will supercharge their ability to deliver and with urgency. So that's my closing pitch, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. I'm gonna kick us off. Can you go back to the one with the nice clip art?
Oh, yeah.
It's not you, it's the windows. There's a vacuum that gets created. This is a lot of stuff
Mhm.
to be done and to be managed. In most towns that don't have real staff, meaningful, many staff and are mostly volunteers, how will any of this happen?
So without CHIP, all of these steps happen. So where things are being built.
Things are not, there are lots
partnership-
of places things are not being built.
Right,
Yes.
where things are built. This is happening. And in fact, it's really harder because the towns are grappling with these many layered stacks, each grant, each tax credit, each revenue stream into that funding stack for a public improvement or a public-private partnership has its own strings attached. CHIP in many ways streamlines the back end work and preparation of the municipality and puts it in more in their control. And it also provides the technical assistance. Right now, what happens when a municipality wants to do something ambitious that its people have voted forward, whether that's a sewer extension, a public park renovation, a TIP district, list goes on. New fire department building. Right now, what they do is they go out for the technical assistance. They do the feasibility study. They go out for the technical assistance. They do the pre-development work. They go out for the technical assistance and then they build the funding stack. Then they go for the vote for the bond to fill whatever gap exists. And then they start the project management. And when I say go out for, I mean, they are participating in competitive processes, town against town, to access a technical assistance provider. So all of this happens in low resource towns just to do the basic stuff. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. Because your experience in Burlington too,
Mhm.
I'm wondering, in previous testimony, one of the folks testified about the backwards nature of having the permits required before you go for the VEPC approval.
Oh, yeah, that's a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even when you were talking about it, you said you have to get some of your initial permits before you go for VEPC approval. So I'm wondering if you could.
So what you may have to do is acquire an initial permit, like an initial zoning permit, if you need pre-development financing of some kind to get through that pre-development period.
But all the permits for wastewater and everything else, you.
Yeah. Typically, this is like a broad strokes answer. Burlington's built a lot of stuff, right? And they've done it in partnership with the federal government. They've done it in partnership with private developers. They've done it in partnership with a lot of people in the room right now. Generally, if there was an early permit acquisition, say such for like stormwater, or an early like engineering or design cost, like a conceptual design or conceptual engineering, not like engineering to spec. Burlington, through its development agreement, would put that on the developer for the short term, with the understanding that the funding that they have identified ultimately to pay for that project would then reimburse that cost. That's a strategy that Burlington has used with great effect, and many other municipalities do that as well outside of TIF development. So if there is a non-governmental partner, actually, even when there is a government, like an intergovernmental partner, that's usually the municipality's first approach, is like V-Trans, pay for the conceptual design. Then when we have it, we go for the financing that we are planning to go for, whatever that is, federal grant, right? And then we'll reimburse those costs. That's a pretty normal approach.
And so when you were in other committees testifying on this, did you talk about that particular?
The permit, yeah, so we didn't, and I'm really glad you asked, because the requirement to have all permits in hand prior to VEPC approval really destroys or like disrupts the normal pre-development process. And it depends on the project and it depends on the type of public improvements that are necessary. This might not happen. But if it's a complex process, like if this is gonna be a Main Street development, over 200-year-old combined sewer, if there's public utility, natural gas, communication unit district, defunct, whatever, under the ground. And more than one party to the agreement, the infrastructure agreement, and a big building. Let's say the 60-unit SGA building. There will be permits that have to be acquired in a certain sequence. So like you'll have to get a storm water permit before a wastewater permit, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for that, because I don't know if you have any suggestions as to how we might tweak that. But the other question.
Yeah, I do, which is basically if you want to keep if you want to keep the requirement for an Act 250, if you want Act 250 to apply, then you can say subject to the requirement for Act 250, but strike that they need the permit acquired. Yeah, that would be our suggestion.
Yeah. And one last thing, inclusion zoning in Burlington.
Yeah.
So if you talk about a development of so many units and a certain percent have to be in the affordable range, that's not contemplated in here. So is it scale? Is that what makes it work in Burlington? So, because I think in the rural parts, if you're talking about 20-unit development, it'll never happen. And
Yeah.
a tiny little town, but. So I'm just thinking about, what's the requirement? Is it 10 units? Then you have to.
I think above 10 units, it's 20%, but then there's another step. The reason I don't know is because Burlington has reformed its inclusionary zoning requirement twice within the last decade. Many people think it does inhibit development. One thing that has is a pressure relief valve. So Burlington has a housing trust fund that is a municipal fund that grants money to affordable housing developers to maintain and build new perpetually affordable housing. There's an opportunity you can choose to build the inclusionary units, or you can choose to pay the housing trust fund. A lot of the smaller projects choose to pay the impact fee. Other projects move forward because having inclusionary units opens up a world of state and federal subsidy that is not available to the developer unless they have the inclusionary units anyway. So it's sort of an enhancement. When it works, it sort of functions as like a local enhancement to all of the other types of subsidies and incentives that are available to mixed income and perpetually affordable developments. I'm glad you brought that up because the LCT supports the enhanced 80-20 increment for the affordable, 20% of the units are affordable for a CHIP development. I'm going to assume we all agree with the goal of building affordable housing. And I'll skip past that reason. There's two other reasons. One is because the perpetual affordable units, or units that are affordable for a long period of time even, have an effect on the tax increment and make less increment available for the necessary public improvements. So that's one sort of objective reason to have that enhanced increment for those projects. Another is because we see from the municipal perspective how that really supercharges, I'm gonna use that word again, other recent actions by state and local governments. So one is the various types of subsidy, both tax credit, grants, and revolving loans that the state supports through appropriation that have a location-based eligibility. So there are a number of these subsidies that are designed artfully to encourage, not just encourage the construction of affordable housing, but to encourage them in downtowns and villages, which has a great synergy with CHIP as conceived. And Act 47 required the density bonus. Act 47 added a new municipal preemption that requires a substantial density bonus for affordable developments. So it's 40% density bonus plus a floor of habitable space. So we think that when you look at the SMART goals we have for land use, the need we have for affordable and mixed income housing, the subsidies that the state has invested hundreds of millions, over 100 million just in FY24 for the subsidies that are within the state's control and are programmed and delivered by the state. And then all the work that municipalities have done at the local level over the last 3 years to adapt to those requirements and incentives. We think CHIP is a really great layer on the layer cake that will really productively incentivize market rate developers and affordable developers to build these mixed income projects in downtowns. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Good.
Yes. Hello, thank you for being here. We'll need a moment for the changing of the guard because their thing's plugged in and stuff.
Yeah.
And so folks, I asked Chris to come here not to speak about sort of all the big picture. I think we've had enough big picture today. But to sort of build on that, the smart growth presentation from this morning to get our heads around capital stacks. So we actually know, sort of can get a better sense of scale. Thank you very much for all of your mathing on this.
Chris Donnelly with the Champlain Housing Trust. Thanks. I'm just logging into the Zoom now. If you don't know Champlain Housing Trust, we serve the 3 northwest counties of the state. We are a housing owner, developer, provide a lot of services. We have roughly 2,700 apartments in our portfolio. Another 700 or so shared equity homes. But we have, so we mostly serve these 3 northwest counties, but we have a couple programs that we run statewide. We have a manufactured home replacement loan fund that is funded by the Affordable Housing Tax Credit that you all expanded a couple years ago. We just log in here. And we also have a farm worker housing program that helps farmers finance upgrades and improvements to homes that they have on farm to serve workers. So logging in. So thanks. And again, as the chair said, I'm not going to go over the need for housing. I'm not going to use words like or numbers like 24,000 or 36,000. We all know that. What I do want to say is that we're supportive of this program and concept. I have a couple suggestions to improve it. And then I want to show you an example or two of, or at least one example of recent development and what we need to pull in to make a development work. And then I've done some modeling to show you how the CHIP funding would kind of be available for development. So some of you may remember last year, I worked on a lot of different spreadsheets. I was in here to create a kind of a 10-year model or plan to see if we can address homelessness and housing problems in the state. So I've been working around spreadsheets for a little bit. It's one of my favorite things. First, I'll just start with the three kind of recommendations I'll make. One is very specific, and it's in the definition section, and it's the definition 14 of low and moderate income housing development. I've heard a lot of people talk about the need to include affordable housing. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the differentiation between a 70% retention and 8% retention in the bill. I also have been hearing a lot of people saying it's kind of hard to make sure that it's compliance if we're going to be creating affordable housing, to have compliance. You know, in Vermont, we've had this policy, long-term policy of when we invest money, we get permanent affordability. The one suggestion I have is first to rename the lower moderate income housing development to mixed income, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about some affordable and some that are not restricted in terms of price. But then at the end of that definition, we say that the restrictions of the covenants are effective in perpetuity. And that's Samantha was just talking about how a lot of for-profit developers or market developers will bring in a nonprofit to help make the deals work. And so that's just one suggestion, and I can send that to John if you'd like some language. Second suggestion, and I've heard a lot of talk about but-for tests. And it makes some sense to me. I don't feel like terribly strongly about this, but I think it makes sense that you should be providing this resource. We know that it's going to be housing that's going to be built because of it. And so I encourage you to think about including some kind of test in the bill. I don't think it's unreasonable if people are going to be building housing because they're getting the increment, or because they're getting the financing from the increment, then they can prove that and go forward. The third thing I've heard some discussion about, and I haven't followed all the conversations, I'm sorry, but is a cap on the amount of financing and the amount of education fund intervention that's available. I understand the inclination and the desire to help protect the ed fund and to make sure that we're not, that we're protecting the ed fund, I guess. I would suggest that if you're going to go down that route, then maybe for mixed income developments, you understand that there's another public benefit to that, and maybe not have a cap on mixed income developments. Just my fear, and just the way the world works, is that if there's a cap on this program, there may be a run for the projects for people to get financing, and we may be funding all the projects that come first, and that makes me a little nervous. So those are my three kind of primary recommendations for you. There may be some others that come up as I go along, but what I would like to do is share, this is online as well, share just great. So this is an affordable housing development that's under construction right now.
This is on our page if anyone needs a larger.
Yeah, don't read it. Yeah. I will make it a little bit bigger when I get to the numbers so you can see that. But this is a redevelopment of a site in Shelburne. It used to be the home of Harbor Place. People may have heard of that. There was a motel that served people who are experiencing homelessness. We purchased a motel across the road, and now we're redeveloping the site into 26 condominiums that are all permanently affordable, and 68 apartments. So that's close to 100 new homes that are being built right now. We should be finishing. I know we're selling the first homes right now. If you can see this, I'll make this a little bit bigger. You can see two funding stacks. On the left are the condominium funding sources, 15 million. And on the right is the apartment funding sources. And so there's a lot of collaboration between these because it's all on the same site, same road, so forth. So there's intersection with the development of the construction of these two developments. I did a little, I looked at the budget further. Well, I don't know if you can count how many sources, but you see this maybe 20 some odd sources that we had to assemble in order to make this work. Some as small as, what, 150,000, and some larger through those resources that the state received from the American Rescue Plan Act. So this is what in our world is a 4% low-income housing tax credit deal. The more valuable tax credits, if we've gone through this, but are the 9%, and that would bring in 2/3 of the cost of the rental development. This, you'll see that the tax credits on that first line are 14 million of 41 million. So we had to bring in a lot of other sources to make this deal work. I did the math on this. There is roughly $5 million worth of infrastructure, roads, sewer, all the other acquisition costs, demolition, all that kind of stuff that went into developing this. When I look at the increments that we would get in the financing, we would be able to service through the increment. We would be able to finance about 2 million of that 5 million. And these are rough numbers, just projecting. So if you see in the sources, there would be one of the medium sources in one of the. So it's a valuable tool. We would support it. What it would do in the affordable housing world is it would mean that the other sources that you appropriate to BHCB or we use from federal funds or so forth could be used somewhere else. So in my mind, when you're building affordable housing, there's always a yes to the but-for test because we're able to build housing elsewhere because of this infrastructure financing. So I just wanted to give you, I know you saw some modeling and some capital stack that was a little bit broader this morning. This is a real development that's happening as we speak in Shelburne. So I'll pause there.
So does the Champlain Group now have ownership of this development and how is that in perpetuity included down the road?
Mhm.
I noticed you've got a figure of 1725 for a 3-bedroom. To keep that for 10 years, how does that work?
I could come back sometime and describe our shared equity homeownership program, but essentially in shorthand, the owner gets to come in at a lower cost mortgage, and in exchange for that, they decide to share. They agree to share any future equity that the appreciation of the home with the next buyer. And so they only walk away with some of the appreciation. They leave the rest behind in the property, and we buy down that debt. But we enter into the chain of title, and we steward that equity.
And that equity is based on a fair market value at the time?
So the equity is based on the fair market value from when they buy to when they sell. So there's an appraisal done from when they buy and when they sell, and then a portion of it goes with them, and anything that paid down on the mortgage, and then a portion of it stays with the home. You could afford it. Awesome program.
Thank you.
Awesome program.
Awesome.
I'm just looking at financial stack and, the 9.6 million from ARPA is probably not going to come back again.
No, and that's a good point. Is that there is a lot of development happening in the affordable world right now, and it's because the state did use some of those resources, a lot of those resources, to try to address this issue. And so, yes, we are about to hit a point where we are kind of going off a cliff. We're going to see a few more groundbreakings, and then we're going to slow down. Pre-pandemic, these resources, in my shop, we were doing maybe 40 apartments a year. And so right now, I said we were a developer. We have this project going with almost 100. We have about 40 being built in downtown Burlington. we just finished 65 in Colchester. So we have lots going. And we have, pipeline of, another couple hundred.
You showed us a stack that doesn't use any increment.
Doesn't use
And
any.
you maybe inadvertently proved to us that you don't need any increment. So I'm wondering how increment would fit into a stack like this and maybe ARPA, yeah.
Yeah, so oops. Um, this means we need to use more of the public resources. This is, the increment, the financing from CHIP would replace some of these, some of this funding that we have in this funding stack and allow us to build more, in other places.
Anyone?
That's good.
Okay.
So I'm going to share something else now, and I'm going to have a few disclaimers with this. So I thought about, when I think about this, I do think about how much money I put into this. What does this really mean? What does this mean for development? And this is on your site in a little bit different form. So what I thought was, how can we scale this? How can we look at this in terms of the impact it has on developments? And this is where my mind goes, is this worth it? What point is it not worth it to be chasing new sources? So I tried to model out the impact on, or the benefit to single family home developments and multifamily home developments. And so I talked to a few people. I did a lot of this modeling last year, but not for this program, but I talked to a lot more people than I did on this one. So there may be other people, smarter people than I, that have better numbers here, and I'm fine with that. I just want to give you something to be able to look at to say, is this actually viable? Or is it an important source? So I'll just go through my assumptions, and I'll tell you first out that I didn't have enough information to separate tax bills or the tax rates, the municipal and education fund. So I just lumped them all in together. So you're going to have to just know that the municipality is paying the same as the ed fund for this modeling. I didn't look at real examples of development. I tried to just create a model that was agnostic to where it was, because there's all sorts of different dynamics in play in terms of forecasting. I used some data that was on VHFA's board, and then our website, and then these shared equity homes that Higley asked about. They're typically valued at 70% of market when they're assessed. So those are the assumptions I put in for the single family homes, and I'll get to the sheets in a second. The multifamily homes, we value them for tax purposes differently than we value them on an income basis. So we look at how much the rent is that is being collected, and then we base taxes on that. We base the value on that, and then it goes taxed at that. So it's a little different of a beast, and it's a little harder to get at. I do know, and I started with what we use, and when we do our modeling of new development, we say that $125 per month in the rent goes to paying the property taxes. That's an affordable development. I looked at four different properties in the Chittenden County area, and just try to get at a ballpark number for what market rate development. These are relatively new ones. I know what I can get an estimate of things that have been in use for a while, but these are relatively new ones. And what I used the lower ballpark number. So I used a $325 per unit per month for taxes. So we need to think about the land and the home ownership. The land is worth $100,000 for a permitted site. For rental, it's closer to $25,000. And I used $30 as an estimate because that was in one of the pieces I found. So again, disclaimer, this is a model that's just based on the best information I have and I can collect over the last 3 days, 4 days.
And folks, this might be helpful for people to look at.
Yep.
Later. And we can't post, Excel documents. We can just post PDFs and
Yeah.
the Sorsha can send it.
So the PDF is,
Yeah, the PDF is posted, and if people want access to the Excel, Sorsha can send it to you.
yeah, and I'm happy to provide this to JFO too, if that's helpful for you. So what I'll do is I'm gonna walk you through a couple of these. And I'm gonna go one by one. On the sheet, on your website, it has all of it together, but I want to walk through one by one. So for home ownership development, the current construct is if you do all market rate, you get a 70% increment, right? So the math here is you have the value of the home. Here, 616. Total value, I just put in 50 homes in all of these developments just to keep them all the same. You get the price of land, so you'd be able to create the taxable value that we're taxing. And then the retention percentage, you can see, I just used the statewide average rate for the property taxes that are collected, it's 460. And then the amount retained is 321. And if you service a bond for 20 years at 5%, maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 6%, I put in 5%, you get to finance $4 million worth of infrastructure under this model. People follow me? Am I going through this too fast or? Yeah? Okay. So what I did was I said, okay, well, if it's a 70% increment, if it's all market. If you have a mixed income development, you get that 80%. You get that little bit of a incentive to include the inclusivity. So I ran through the same numbers, and you see here, the numbers are a little different on the top because you only have 80% of the homes are market rate. And then at the bottom, you have some affordable homes. So you'll see that the affordable homes are worth the increment a lot less. But what this shows is that it's not that much different in terms of the amount of, on the very bottom line, not that much different between 70 and 80% in terms of the amount of infrastructure you can finance. What it doesn't do, and this is important for me and I know others, it does not provide an incentive for a private developer to encourage inclusivity in mixed income housing in their development. They can just go ahead and do the 100% market. That's just what it tells me. There may be other reasons that they would do this. They may need to have other financing come in because they don't want to take on a 50-unit development. They want to do a 30 and they want to partner with someone else. There may be a development agreement with the municipality that says, in order for us to participate here, we need you to have some affordability in. So there may be some other reasons, or there may be Burlington, there's inclusionary zoning. But it tells me right now is that there's no significant difference here. And this is home ownership. What I'll do is to illustrate equity. This is what you would get in the third column if it was 100% affordable. So there's no market rate. This is just a nonprofit developer like me or Habitat or someone else that's coming in. And you'll see there's about $1 million difference in the same 50-unit development. There's about $1 million difference in the amount of infrastructure you could finance. So to me, that just raises equity questions. I'm not sure how you solve this, except playing with the numbers a little bit. I'm trying to take my advocacy hat off a little bit just to provide you information. Someone once told me the best thing you can be is useful. So I'm just trying to be useful. I do have a point of view sometimes, but what I did in the next one, and there's going to be, apologize, there's going to be 2 more columns that jump in. So what I have here is if you were, one of the leverage you have is the amount of increment that you offer in the bill. Right now you have 70 for mixed income or 70 for just market rate or no affordable. And you have 80 for mixed income. So if you went to a high percentage, if there was A higher percentage, if it was a mixed income development, say 90% instead of 80%, you get these numbers. That may provide the incentive for the private developer to say, yeah, we'll work with someone else to make sure there's some inclusivity here. The other lever you have is you could lower the increment on the market rate. Lower that down 10%. I'll provide you the spreadsheet. You can open source. You can put in your own numbers and play with it. That may also provide incentive. So it's just a way to think about some of the levers that you have and a tool that you can use. Everyone with me? I have the same set of slides for multifamily or rental housing. And one thing I just look at the numbers at the bottom here. This is another thing that just pops out at me in terms of equity. The amount of value that you are offering for home ownership, and maybe this is a great policy choice, but the amount of value that you're providing for home ownership under this program is much higher than for rental. If the development needs as much increment, if there were that infrastructure. So again, I'll start with the current construct, 100% market. Here's at 70%. Again, this is the properties are valued at a different manner. You get about 1.5 million. 50-unit development. All right. For a mixed income, about the same. It's kind of similar to the home ownership. There's have a very similar amount of infrastructure you can finance for this, even though it's a little less than home ownership, but it's similar. And then the third I have here is 100% affordable, and you can see there's quite a drop off for the affordable one. It's about a third of what you could finance. And then the same exercise as I had before. If you went to 90% for mixed income, it brings in a little bit more, of course. And if you lowered, it will reduce the amount that 100% market could finance. I hope I've stunned you all.
Yeah, I think everyone's looking forward to being able to dive into their own spreadsheets, or at least a few people who get really excited about things like that.
But I'm happy to answer questions in this, and if other people say, I got the numbers wrong, I don't have any ego about that, and happy, but it's a tool you can plug in other things, and I just thought it would be helpful or useful.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time on this, Chris. I think we're good.
Okay.
Saoirse, can you forward the spreadsheet to
I will
folks?
send
Or
it.
you sent the PDF. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Generally preferred.
Yes.
And thank you for sending the spreadsheet so people can play.
Will do.
Thank you. So folks, I asked staff team to draft a possible amendment. I am not attached to it. I think it's a good starting point for us to have discussions. I think everyone's coming from like a slightly different angle on this one. I think it's, as I said yesterday, I think it's important that we put some boundaries on this so we can make sure we understand, or at least attempt to understand, education fund possible exposure. And so I'm going to ask actually Pat to start with sort of a central concept that I asked him to put together. And then John can take us through language that also has a few more guardrails added to it. But the big picture is essentially, can we put a limit on how much increment is available from the entire education fund, right? And in trying to pick a number to start with of like how much increment might be available, Didn't want to go statewide because wanted to make sure that some counties that might move slower than others would be able to jump in. So asked Pat to build something that was county by county to share with us. And then the other piece is thinking about sort of in other conversations we've had about this, the tension between background growth and increment that's, could be attributable to this. And so I thought a good place to start to have this conversation would be essentially the amount of background growth that we're naturally seeing would be how much would be available. And so that's what Pat is going to take us through because he's going to explain the details of it better than I would and makes nice charts.
Okay. So this is also on the committee's page. So many pop-ups will come up when you start sharing your screen. So this is on your committee page. I am Patrick Turton. I'm with the Joint Fiscal Office. And so, yeah, that was a good lead-in. Essentially, the thought and process here was to think about, what is the total sort of exposure you all are willing to sort of put upon the education fund for the retention amount. And also, hearing some concerns about rush on the program. How are some ways to sort of think about that so that certain areas with the more resources to be able to implement wouldn't be able to sort of get access first. So there's a bit of a geographical component to it, which you'll see. And this is a slide originally, I think Julia put together, but it's become sort of boilerplate on all of our presentations. Just a reminder that I'm not pitching this idea to you. I'm just here to sort of walk you through how we got to some of the numbers that you'll see and some of the language that John has.
Whole way to.
And so right off the bat, usually I try to bury the lead and show you what the numbers are at the end, but here I've got them right up front. And so essentially, county by county, we've calculated the maximum ed fund increment cap that CHIP projects in each of those counties would be eligible for. And so seeing these cap numbers doesn't mean that we can estimate what the cost of this program will be to the ed fund. We still don't have some of those tools we'd need, like how many projects are we talking about, the scope of the projects, some of the but-for considerations. So this is not to say that this program will cost this much to the ed fund in each of these counties, but it sort of puts an upper bound on the limit of exposure that the program would have in each county.
Representative Woody, can we wait just a little bit for questions? Thanks.
And I will note that John will have more sort of implementation and administration details on this that he can provide when he goes through that. So how do we get to these numbers? This is just like a three-step process, basically, and I'll have tables with the numbers for each county to show you how that sort of manifests itself. So what we have available as most recent is the 2024 equalized grand list value. We have previous years to compare to, and we also have projections moving forward of what average annual statewide growth is in the equalized grand list. And so from there, by applying that sort of growth percentage, we can look at what basically a year's worth of growth in the equalized grand list value is. So from there, we can take that and apply the non-homestead rate. For this exercise, we have the fiscal year 25, which is the most recent available, to get to look at what the value of the education tax is associated with that sort of 1 year's worth of growth. So if we're good there, from there, we take that sort of tax value, we can apply the retention percentage to that, which in this case for fully market is 70%, which gets us to the sort of total potential education property tax increment retention associated with a year's worth of background growth. Does that sort of conceptually check out? So yeah, it would basically equate to the total amount of education tax increment that can be retained from the projects in each of these counties. So to look at it, and each table that I'm going to show you in each slide will sort of build on the other one. The end point of each table is sort of the starting point of the next one. But first thing I looked at was comparing 2023 to 2024 to see what the most recent year's worth of background growth was between that particular year. You can see that the statewide average was 14%. And if you look at the TIF report, and if you look at actually Ted's fiscal note that he drafted, I think in the next couple of years, the forecasted growth in the equalized grand list value is right around 14%. So this is sort of a smell test for what the background growth was last year and what's sort of forecasted going forward. It's sort of, when you look at it statewide, they sort of mesh well together. So, like I said, we have the 2024 equalized grand list value. We take the 14% sort of background growth, and we get to the value of that background growth. For example, I live in Washington County. That was about $1.7 billion, if I'm reading this correctly. And overall, it's about 19 in taxable and the value of the growth. So we take that value of growth and we can move over to this next slide where we then apply. I'm sorry, this column right here is supposed to have the non-homestead rate, which is 1.391 is the one we're using.
The one on our website actually does. That's what I was confused, because your slide is different than the one that's on the website.
I guess,
Stop sharing and then you can pull up the one on the website.
yeah, that's actually great.
Okay.
I don't know how that got swapped. Or it's all moments.
I mean, that might have been a dull moment. I don't know.
Yes, that's what I was saying. Our page was different than his page. I started to scratch my head right about the time you said, no. I thought it was me. It had to be me.
I guess I'm not quite sure how to make this full screen, but hopefully this is big enough and you also have. Something to follow along. That's a fun snafu. So we were right here, and this shows what I was intending to show. So we applied that non-homestead rate to the sort of annual value of the background growth to get sort of what the education income or sort of education property tax would be associated with that. So you can see here that, again, I'll use Washington County as an example. The value of that tax growth, before we talk about anything to do with retention, is about 23 million. And in sum, this is the total taxable, the total tax value of that growth subject, if we were to subject it to the non-homestead rate. Oh yeah, I can't use the arrows, I have to scroll. So yeah, in this fourth column here, you see what the tax value of that growth was. Then we look at the next slide to think about what does that look like in terms of the total amount that can be of the increment that can be retained if we were just set caps based on that tax value growth. So you can see here that there's about $190 million that would be sort of the statewide cap. So this column here is sort of what to look at when thinking about what the cap would be for the education income tax increment retention. But it does vary county by county based on sort of what their existing 2024 equalized grand list value is, as it is today. So it does limit some of the smaller counties by scope because from the start they are already a smaller county in terms of property tax value. And then you can see obviously Chittenden County here would have the highest cap. And again, it's all sort of tying back into what their underlying equalized grand list value is. So sort of the thought process here in a sense is that, okay, we're taking a year's worth of background growth and basically using that as the basis for the cap on the education income tax increment that can be retained over the course of the program. So spread over the period of financing.
So this would not all be in a single year. It would be over however long the debt service. time is.
Yes.
So it could be 20 years.
And it would be something that Betsy has to consider when going through the application process and approving it. And then again, so couple other columns here, you can see that I've included sort of what the ed fund portion would be associated with that if we were taking the same process. And then also what through this process would be available in terms of increment for the municipalities. I have 100% here. And they don't have to do over 85, but just I guess it shows sort of the maximum in theory that they would have available that they could use for this purpose. So that's sort of the stepwise showing of how the calculation sort of comes together and what it's based on and what different elements that we're using. But in a sense, this is sort of the landing point is county by county. This is the amount of ed fund increment that can be retained. Agnostic to it could be 50 projects that retain that full amount, could be one in theory. But it's spread over the course of the program. And again, I'll just reiterate, I'm not telling you right now that this is how much it would cost the ed fund in increment. I'm saying that this is just the upper limit on the total exposure that could be held. The program could only go through half of it in theory, or its lifespan, or it could hit the limit. But if it does hit the limit before it's over, they have the opportunity to come tell you what's going on, and it gives you a chance to sort of flesh out whether any alterations are appropriate.
Thanks. And I'm going to ask folks to direct questions towards Pat about how he got to the numbers he did and what is happening inside the math. And then let's have a conversation about it all after we talk through the language with John. Does that sound good? Okay, Charlie.
So you're using the background growth 14% is you're using the equalized grand list, which is going to accommodate for market appreciation and any new investment.
That'd be my understanding, yes.
So it doesn't separate the two. And then this also then calculates the maximum exposure as if there was increment retained in every single community, every property.
Right.
Which we know won't happen. Okay. So
It's just sort of a basis for sort of statewide grand list growth. Which I know we're talking about much more limited, eligible locations here.
Person Brennan?
The caps end up to be such that the less rural counties have more, their caps are higher. Why is that? Or is that not a good question for right now?
Well, the value of the grand list is going to be much higher in Chittenden County than it would be in Essex County, for example, just because the sheer value of the real estate there is much higher.
But for the purposes of the CHIP, Essex County needs more help. It's a more rural community. Every speaker we said that they can't use the TIFs, but they could use the CHIPs. It's smaller communities
And so Representative Brennan, that would be a good question for us to discuss later. And maybe we want to, as a discussion, decide that the whole thing should be this, the idea works, but maybe we want to flip it inside out. I don't know. Yeah. Questions for Pat? Yeah.
Pat, this is for CHIP only, doesn't include current TIFs.
This is purely for the proposal in front of you, yeah.
This cap amount is 1 year's worth of the ed fund increment, correct? So you're saying, as example, Addison County, the top one on the row, the ed fund increment is the 10 billion, whatever, and you're saying that as an example, if we use that as the cap, that is all that we would be able, could be retained for the ed fund over the 20-year life.
Yeah.
And as Charlie said, that 10 million is as if every community did something. Okay,
That's right.
but this is.
It's as if the program was maximized, yeah. Question for Pat?
Yes. In 1 year, each.
This would be sort of a
1
cumulative
year gets the 191 or
over the course of the program. So it's basically taking that tax value that we were looking at earlier of the 1 year's worth of growth and having that cost spread out over the 20 years of debt service.
20 years debt service. No, maybe I missed it.
But the accumulation of the value of the education fund increment retention would be spread out over the life of the program.
Here's where I'm getting confused is the life of the program. I'm thinking the life program is still, you can take advantage of this program till 2036, is that it? So I was thinking about.
So that's a good question for John, but there's for the life of the program, when the program might be set to sunset, but each individual, so similarly, if we, let's say we sunset TIF right now, right? TIF, not CHIP. All of the towns that are already in TIF still have a lot of debt service. And so what's designed in the program is 20 years of debt service. And so even if everyone started this year, we're still talking about 20 years of ed fund increment being retained, right? Even if it's a 5-year program. And so we need to think about if it's a 5-year program or a 10-year, if it's a 10-year program, we're looking at 30 years of debt service, right?
10 years.
It's like the debt service will be ending 30 years from now.
Yes. Every year, whenever it starts, you've got 20 years.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay,
But then what's the total amount,
yes,
total amount of help?
Based on this construct, and it's something within your purview of the committee to discuss.
yes.
If it's appropriate.
Representative Higley.
And again, we're using that 14% because that's the increase between 23 and 20.
And forecasted for the next couple of years.
Forecast, right, but conceivably, hopefully that'll go down. As far as, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, so in 10 years, you're looking at 140% increase in those values. Projected.
According to the economists.
Okay, all right, thanks.
I'm still hung up on this, because the way you did it is it's, here's your grant list, 14%, here's your growth. Right? Right, so that's your growth, and it's $19 billion. Right, and then, so what's the next one?
So the next one is we take the
And that's
value.
1 year,
Yep.
so 1 year. Next one is the 7. At the tax rate, the 19, right? Yep, okay. So that's 273 million for that 1 year.
The tax value of that growth, if you were to subject that value to the non-homestead rate.
Right.
Obviously, the way you
Right,
construct
yeah.
the rates is much more complicated than all that.
Right, just the simplest example. So it's $273 million per year. And then your next one is 70% of that 273 million. So that's what you could have in an annual exposure.
Not annual exposure. So this is just saying the value of that 1 year. That is over the course of the entire program, the amount of education increment retained cumulatively adds up to that amount.
Why would it be cumulative? Because that's 1 year of growth.
That's what I asked Pat to model.
You can take any random number for how much we're gonna limit the increment.
This just seemed to have an internal logic to me.
Okay. Right, yeah, I just can't make the math work in my head that way.
I think in a sense, and correct me, it's essentially like saying we're willing to put a year's worth of grand list growth towards this problem or towards this program
In the life of the program.
over the course of the life of the program. Yeah.
Any other, thank you, Pat, really appreciate it. So a second go at getting our heads around this idea. And just a few other, thank you, John, if you wanna, thanks. A few other, this is sort of the conversation that I asked John to put into amendment again. These are just ideas to start a conversation.
So in the absence of a different formula, that's kind of.
Hello.
Better than the COVID.
John Ray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am still me. Good.
Did you just say I am still me?
It.
I thought so.
Still here.
So good.
We're all still here too.
Let me screen share.
And folks, we are here till 4:15. John, do we have you till 4:15?
I am technically supposed to go to conference committee at 4.
Okay.
But,
How things go? Cool.
so. Yeah, let me jump in then. And just to foreground the sets of changes that you're going to see here in the draft. So at the outset, we're going to talk about switching from the low to moderate income housing criterion that you've seen in the previous drafts to picking up the affordable housing definition that already exists in Title 24. So that's affordability construct that you could consider, tightening up the definition of improvements to be a list of exhaustive sets of infrastructural improvements, providing for that primary residence domicile piece in perpetuity, adding a but-for test, accelerating the sunset to 2030 as opposed to 2035 for the CHIP program, new concept instead of gross floor area, a different concept which we can talk about, restricting the location criteria. We'll talk about the cap that Pat just presented on, and then a few technical things related to rulemaking, and we'll do a big thing at the end of this draft. So I will just jump right in. So first thing you see on page 1 of this draft 1.1, this is just standalone language. I don't have the full of S127 pulled up here. This is just the CHIP language. So first is adding in those.
Can I just jump in here? Folks, if anyone has any thoughts that they need to have about anything about the rest of the bill, like, please talk to me privately, because I'm not planning on us spending any more time on it at all. Thank you.
And I would encourage you to talk to JFO about one technical thing, and I can also maybe.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first change you're seeing here.
I'm sorry, but to clarify what I said, there's a whole bunch of other language in S127 that has nothing to do with CHIP. I'm not planning on us spending any more time on that other non-CHIP related language unless someone specifically talks to me about a need to do that.
Within the CHIP language.
The CHIP language we're spending, yes, that's what we're doing, just all that other stuff.
Mobile home improvement
Yes.
program and
Exactly.
all the time. This language.
It's stuff that's not me, don't talk about it. That's all.
Yes,
The only other thing that I'm waiting for is, sounds like there was a couple of people that had some purpose language.
yes, and that's, yes,
I'm gonna hear
I
that.
believe we will get that.
Okay.
Yes, and that would be part of this.
Okay, page 1, definitions, pulling in the Title 24 definitions of affordable housing and affordable housing development. I'm gonna just pull up the statute so you can see exactly what these are. We've talked about them. But affordable housing has 2 different constructs based on whether owner occupied or renter occupied. Owner occupied is that for which the total annual cost of ownership does not exceed 30% of the gross annual income of a household at 120% of AMI. And then there's these different figures. You could be the highest of county median, standard metropolitan. So think of the owner occupied as tied to 120% of AMI. And then think of rental housing as total annual cost of renting doesn't exceed 30% of the gross annual income of a household at 80% of AMI. So that's what your construct is for affordable housing. And then that just tells you we have to create mechanics to get at the structure right, because an affordable housing development isn't necessarily one in which 100% is allocated to affordable housing. It's just one in which a particular percentage is allocated to that. So that's why you need a separate definition for affordable housing development. And that's what you see here. A housing development of which at least 20% of the units or a minimum of 5 units, whichever is greater, are affordable housing units. And then you have your covenant language here. Affordable units shall be subject to covenants or restrictions to preserve their affordability for a minimum of 15 years or longer as provided in municipal bylaws. What that time period is specifying there is
you're getting a minimum of 15 years in your covenants. And if the municipal bylaws provide for a longer period, which could be theoretically in perpetuity for affordable housing, that would necessarily be picked up here. So that is your construct for what an affordable housing development is. If you're thinking of your incentive structure, we had that affordability criterion that said this needs to be low to moderate income housing development, right? To get that extra 10% increment. In place of that, you would have this affordable housing construct, which would say to get that extra 10% increment, you would need to meet these definitions of affordable housing, which are, again, this is what is currently in Title 24, so it's not something novel. Okay, I'm going to keep going just to try to get through this as quickly as I can. The definition of improvements, we're on page 2. What you'll have seen in the last draft was a list that is standard TIF language, right? It speaks to infrastructure, and then it provides an indicative list of items like this whole list, but it's not necessarily exhaustive. What this approach tries to do here is spell out an exhaustive list of improvements or infrastructural improvements that you think would be appropriately funded with tax increment. So we had talked about what is public recreation yesterday, not taking a position on this. This is a way of spelling out exactly what you say should be permissibly funded by tax increment financing. So here what you see, the list is the installation or construction of power or telecommunications infrastructure, wastewater, stormwater, water dispersal, water collection, water treatment facilities and equipment, or related wastewater, stormwater, or water equipment, public roads, streets, bridges, multimodal facilities, public transit stop equipment and amenities, street and sidewalk lighting, sidewalks, streetscapes, wayfinding signs and kiosks, traffic signals, medians, or turn lanes. I will just say, I did not invent this language. This was pulled from the 2015 TIF rules. It has a list of examples of kinds of classic infrastructure that they pursue. There are a few things that are not included from that. So for instance, you don't see parking or garages listed here. We do have multimodal facilities. So if you had transit happening within an area, but there is no specific call out for garages. But the concept, the way to think about this is, what would you want in your exhaustive list of kinds of infrastructure that you think should be appropriately funded by tax increment financing, if you like this concept, but it is just a concept for consideration. You still hold on to old pieces of the definition of improvements, including that site preparation for development or redevelopment, including land and property acquisition, demolition, brownfield remediation, or flood remediation mitigation. And then you have the separate technical provision, which we talked about for covering your debt service interest payments in that first time period in which you may not have sufficient increment. I'm seeing folks antsy, so I'm not sure if I
I'm
should.
gonna let you finish that chunk of yellow.
Yeah, so the way to think about this concept of the improvements, exhaustive list of kinds of infrastructure. And then you have this separate piece for site preparation, which would include acquisition, demolition, brownfield remediation, flood remediation and mitigation, which is something that's been embraced in a lot of concepts of improvements across drafts in every room that I've been in. So that is the concept here. The key difference is it is not a broad bucket. You can fund infrastructure with an indicative list. It is an exhaustive list of things that could be funded. And note that there's still conditions attached. They have to serve a public good and fulfill the purpose of the subchapter as well. So you got to meet those purpose constraints, and then you got to be one of these items. So if you like this concept, the list really matters, and you want to make sure that it picks up what you want covered.
Representative Folsom, I think, had a question for you.
I'm just wondering how when you talk about site preparation, could you help us understand if there's any limits on whose property, who the owner is of the property that you're seeing the public funding?
The extent of the limitation would be provided by this lead-in of that will serve a public good and fulfill the purpose of the subchapter. There is no independent constraint. I think you're asking if that site preparation be publicly owned. There's no such independent constraint. I think that's, am I understanding that?
So if, I'm sorry. No.
Nope. Representative Odie?
I was just gonna say, I wonder if Betsy thinks that's an exhaustive list. I understand you say it's based on the 2015 TIF rules, but
Oh, for sure.
I think it's.
No, sorry. Well, I pulled this from their list of items. Their TIF rule doesn't set out everything that they would include in the bucket of infrastructure. So
Get testimony from them?
Maybe, yeah.
So, John, if a developer said, I'm gonna buy that building, tear it down, and then rebuild on that site, that's qualified and that's,
Under this right here, the site preparation for development or redevelopment, assuming you meet that purpose constraint, right, for a public good and serves the purposes of the subchapter. So if you're providing, you're stimulating the development of primary residences for low to moderate income, and that's what you're doing when you tear down a site and replace, then yes. I should say, I'm not the one who will be, these are all my best guesses as to, right?
Can I just go back to a question that you asked yesterday, Chair? Under this language, what incentive is there for any developer to do site prep anywhere in the state without using this?
Can you say that again?
If this language stays in, I'm trying to understand what incentive would there be for any development that doesn't involve CHIP at this point?
Specific to subdivision 2, the site preparation piece.
Right.
So
There's currently a
your
lot
question
of,
has like a double negative implicit in it that like my brain can't process. And I think it's just because it's late in the day.
if I were a developer,
Yes.
I saw this language, I wouldn't do any development unless the state was paying for the site prep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And let's keep on. Any other questions about that? Block O yellow. Yes.
The only one I had is, I don't know, did Representative Branning talk to you at all about her concept for additional items that might be covered under infrastructure?
I think I may know what are you describing, is this related to an incentive structure?
Yes.
So there is a way of doing the incentive structure, which in addition to creating an additional increment, would make available an expanded definition of improvements for anyone who meets that affordability constraint. And so basically what you would have is a new subdivision 3 here that would say for a project that meets the affordability criterion, additionally means the definition of improvements under.
And like other things that are included. in this other
Exactly. You
ones.
could just tie it to the current definition of improvements for TIF districts, something like that. So you could create an enhanced incentive structure that provides a broader bucket of infrastructural items if we think that moves the needle for folks.
Do you have a question about the language?
Yeah, I do.
Great.
So I could see maybe limiting that site preparation to something that we think, well, that like brownfield remediation. And I don't know what else, maybe to PCB removal or something. And maybe also flood mitigation, but if we don't limit it at all, then I'm thinking, so is this the way it reads in,
TIF districts,
TIF districts?
this is permissible under TIF districts, yes.
Well, it just limits the amount of money that can be used elsewhere in a county, if you do it by county.
Oh, you mean if you're accepting an increment retention cap,
Yeah. to put
Um,
an
you
increment.
have a rush on this. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right to think about the incentives of how a cap could.
Yes.
Ask about another incentive. Could the municipality applying for project-based TIF, could you use this provision around site preparation? For example, we were in Hartford the other day and half of their school has to be condemned to deal with PCBs. Could they demo that
Theoretically,
half the bill and the school and prepare the site for rebuilding the school using this language?
Assuming that they could meet all of the other criteria, right? So assuming other things are in place, if the question is just, would that fall into this bucket? I think so. I don't think there's an objection to that falling in.
Okay, let's-
Use it for school.
But my point is, it doesn't have housing. So you can use ed fund to prep housing, but you can't use ed fund for school unless you're building housing on the school grounds.
The way to think about it is the infrastructure that you're financing is sort of the tie to the housing that is produced is really the purpose section, right? That it stimulates the development of housing. But assuming you have an agreement with a developer that is producing housing and part of what incentivizes the creation of that housing, whether it's on the school as you're describing the hypothetical or not, doesn't really matter if it's on that school, right? You could use it to do infrastructural improvements that meet this definition, right? and then separately pursue housing in a separate geographic site. I think that's what you're asking.
Very interesting. It's very interesting.
It is, yes. I want to make sure that we can go through all the
All right.
sections.
This is really big thing.
And so again, this is just taking something that was in the bill that came to us and narrowing it slightly.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to be clear, it's not this was all of these things were permissible in the bill that came to us.
Yes. This is a narrower set of things that constitute improvements.
School construction bill.
I'm just gonna flip quickly because I'm gonna run out of time too. So on page 7, we're in the housing infrastructure agreements section. You'll recall that we discussed this providing terms to ensure that any housing unit be offered exclusively as this domicile. We now have in perpetuity. So instead of having a durational requirement tied to retirement of the financing, this would be for the life of this would be forever, right? This is only to be offered as a primary residence. We can jump next to the application.
I'm sorry, can you clarify is this the section in the is this part of the municipal agreement?
This is the housing infrastructure agreement, which governs the relationship between developer and community and potentially sponsor.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just trying to understand how this would play out. So for example, if a school district hypothetically owned a piece of property on one side of a community that it wanted to put into housing, you could use this to bring wastewater into the town for that housing, but also to the school property.
Yeah, there would be no constraint on what the uses of the infrastructure are, right? Unless that was something that was built into the agreement. So you could be building infrastructure that has multiple uses, school plus the housing that's created.
Folks, I'm not trying to dampen conversation. I just want to make sure we can get the full use of John sitting there before John is sitting there.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Section 1910 is your VEPC application section. We've added now, you see 2 things here, a but-for test. And then this is the accelerated sunset. So previously this was applications had to be submitted by the end of 2035. This is now a check-in end of 2030 effectively. And then the but-for test that's included, it's all highlighted here.
And as folks remember, Smart Growth Vermont Smart Growth America suggested that as sort of a way to bring more accountability.
The but-for test is the same that we use for TIF district, but this is nothing new here. This is the same concept. I have some specific definitions that I use for this program, but it's the same question, right? Determine whether the infrastructure improvements proposed to serve that housing development site and proposed housing development would not have occurred as proposed in the application, or would have occurred in a significantly different and less desirable manner than as proposed. And review takes into account amount of time, additional time that would be required if you didn't have it, how the size and components, including affordable housing, would differ if you didn't have tax increment financing available, amount of revenues, percentages of revenues that would be available. Is your but-for test that exists for TIF districts, and it's just brought in here as a safeguard. The next place we can go is the floor area. I'm sorry, I do have a slight change here for the process requirements. I don't know how substantive this change is, but previously what this is the check on things that a municipality has to have done to get its foot in the door. So they need to have created their project and development site under the subchapter. They need to have executed a housing infrastructure agreement, meeting the standards of section 1909. Previously, it says adhering to the standards of section 1909. So conceivably, that lends itself more readily to an interpretation that it's just VEPC checking that they produced this application. This is trying to call out they need to independently determine that it adheres to the standards of section 1909. I think in both cases, that's what it's trying to say, but this is maybe slightly clearer. Project criteria. So under our sub 1, we have this threshold floor area question. And what you saw yesterday was at least 70% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing. That would pick up things like basements, attics. It could pick up a quite large space. So we now have this language that I discussed with my colleague Damien, who has more familiarity with building codes and the like. And we came up with this concept of floor area that's suitable for occupancy and use for commercial industrial purposes. This does require more discretionary determination, I would say, by VEPC. So this is maybe something to think through with them, but this is trying to get at a more restricted set of floor areas. So anything where a person would naturally be, and that could pick up if your attic, for instance, was intended to be inhabited, it would pick up that as a place for occupancy.
On the language, floor area suitable for occupancy and use for commercial, industrial, and residential of the project house is dedicated to housing.
Yeah.
So the floor area could theoretically be used for occupancy of commercial, industrial, or residential, but still has to be housing.
It's what you're measuring to get at how much housing you have is how much of the floor area is suitable for occupancy and use. But there's,
So the 100% is suitable for all those things and the 70% is housing.
Right, okay, yes, okay, that's what I thought.
yep, and the 70% could be of a floor area that is smaller than the gross floor area, right?
Yep.
If we pick up everything, and of the things that don't fall into the 100% of floor area suitable for occupancy and use, any of that above could be anything else, right? It wouldn't be part of this calculation.
Start now.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Love comments, people love. Okay. Page 10. I got stories for when we're not on live, I promise, but, so one thing that we talked about is this prong 2 is to allow for that chip board to make a separate determination for someone that's not going that threshold route. One thing that could happen is you could have resubmission over and over again if someone's just trying to meet this piece. So this is language trying to get at that. The Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board's determination, whether affirmative or negative, shall be final, and the board shall not reevaluate an application in substantially the same form as one the board has previously rejected. So it recognizes that the same applicant could submit literally a separate application, and they could be obligated to review that. But if they're trying to just submit the same thing over and over again, this is meant to stop that.
So let's finish this yellow section. Yeah.
Location criteria. What you see here is a slimmed down set of.
Oh, yes, sorry,
Yeah, that's cool.
Carol. Go for it. It just happens to be in a yellow chunk, but they're separate sections.
All right, so I thought in the first one, that their board determination was final. So you just really added, and the board shall not reevaluate.
Exactly. It replaces the sentence that said it would be final, because you could see someone saying, well, that means the board's determination is final. Pepsi doesn't have to make a determination here. That's what stands. But can people just circumvent that constraint by resubmitting an application, basically?
Because it was in yellow and underlined. Oh, okay, good.
Location criteria, slimmed down. What you had yesterday included a tier 2 bucket, and you'll recall that there was a future effective expansion of the tier 2 bucket. It also included, importantly, a proviso right here that said, provided that a project that comes in hand with all required Act 250 permits secured doesn't have to meet any location criteria, right? It's just deemed to satisfy the piece. Now you have location criteria and you have to fit into one of these 2 buckets. There's no proviso carve out. You got to be in an area designated tier 1A or B, or interim housing exemption, or one of these existing settlements.
And if we want to, so before it was tier 2 in the future, basically, like with a future implementation date. If in the future we want to implement tier 2, we can do that. We don't have to put it in here now, but since we don't really know what that tier 2 is, it seems wild to put it in a bill from my perspective.
What if we want to put it in here now?
Then we can discuss that tomorrow. Yeah, totally.
Okay, just some, we've already talked about the affordability construct here, but cleaning up the words, this previously said lower moderate, right? And then change to affordability. Okay, this is what Pat was presenting on. We're at the bottom of page 11, the county tax increment retention limits. I was going to say in words what I hope Pat said in numbers. But this does provide 2 things. It sets out the actual numbers that would be the limitations per county. And then I try to provide language that I think describes the proxy these figures are trying to get at. It's basically supplying what's the rationale for these kinds of numbers. So Pepsi shall not approve pursuant to subsection 1910H of this subchapter. That's when it looks at the tax increment financing plan and sees what the increment is proposed to be, and it will also know the retention percentage. So shall not approved, a cumulative amount of education property tax increment retention per county greater than the anticipated amount of education fund revenues that would be foregone in the county, assuming a statewide growth rate equal to the statewide growth rate from 23 to 24, and an education property tax increment retention percentage of 70%. That amount per county is determined by multiplying 70% by the product of the expected growth and the FY25 non-homestead rate. And I can show you those definitions. It's exactly what Pat was talking about. But just to walk you through it, your statewide growth rate, trying to get at what kind of growth could you expect in a given year, but it's a statewide level rather than a county specific level. Your expected growth is how much do we think a county's equalized education property tax grand list would grow. And so you take that grand list value in 24 and you multiply it by that statewide growth rate. It gives you a figure per county that is how much a hypothetical growth in that county. You then multiply that by your FY25 non-homestead rate. That's that $1.391 per $100 of equalized education property value to give you the revenues you would expect on that growth, right? You just apply the non-homestead to the full extent of that growth in county education property tax value. And then what you're doing is multiplying by 70%. That's really what this says, because 70% is what you're envisioning as being retained here. And so that gives you the figures that Pat was talking about, and they are listed here per county. And just to call out, if you like this construct, this would not require VEPSI or anyone to be independently making this calculation. They would just look to this table. The lead-in language is providing the narrative description of what the numbers represent. I'm not going to belabor the numbers. You can see them here, but you can also see them in Pat's presentation. And other pieces of this, a muni shall immediately notify VEPSI if it resolves not to incur debt for an approved project. Upon receiving notification, VEPSI shall terminate that site and may approve additional tax increment financing subject to the aggregate limitations. This is basically if you've approved up to the cap, right? And then someone doesn't end up using their project, we want to make sure that you can go back up to the cap so you could fill back in those dollars that were not used. I am going to have to run in just a second, so let me see if I can hit the last piece here. Clean up language. Information reporting section, we had a end evaluation at the end of the program. This was 2035. Now, in tandem with that sunsetting in 2030, this is the legislative session preceding that. That's when you get your final evaluation.
And some suggestions on that final evaluation we're also waiting on.
Okay. There is a piece related to rulemaking. So previously rulemaking was built into the guidance section and it was the final subsection. It's now a standalone section to call this out. And there's some technical provision included here. So VEPSI may adopt rules reasonably necessary to implement this subchapter. That's what's familiar from the last draft, and shall adopt rules. So this is a specific directive to adopt rules to govern the prioritization of applications submitted for approval of tax increment financing under the subchapter. This language is included because if you have a cap construct, you need some kind of prioritization method. This could be as simple as first in the door, but it could also have other kinds of constraints envisioned. So rulemaking to govern the prioritization of applications. And then there's this piece here to require pre-filing of a rule by 45 days with joint fiscal committee. So at least 45 days prior to pre-filing that rule, VEPSI shall submit a copy of the proposed rule to joint fiscal committee for review.
And VEPSI has done this with joint fiscal before for other new programs.
Okay, no changes to the board. Here's the last big thing. We are now Title 32 VSA 5404AF. We've been talking before about a lot of underlying language, so creating the CHIP program. And now we're talking about existing Title 32 language. This is your TIF districts. And what this does is, at the very end of this, the council shall only approve under this section applications for tax increment financing submitted prior to July 1, 2025. So what this does, if you accepted this proposal, basically you would be replacing TIF districts with the CHIP program. That's what this would do.
Can you say that again?
The simple way to say this is this sunsets TIF districts. It says council will only approve applications submitted for TIF district financing, not CHIP, but TIF district financing submitted prior to July 1, 2025, which is the same date on which the CHIP program would go effective. So this would be removing TIF districts and just replacing it with the CHIP program.
And the idea is that if CHIP is better than TIF, then we don't necessarily need both of them. There are a few TIF districts that are in the hopper right now, and folks are sort of checking around about how, if this will work to not disrupt that.
Which, sorry, I'm back here, sorry.
Yeah.
I've been sitting a lot. So that would just, new TIF districts, right?
Yes.
This does not eliminate existing, and that's part of why it's included in this way, rather than a repeal of all the language, because it's leaving the language intact for Betsy to continue to administer the program will continue on. It's just that no new district.
New application.
And frankly, I don't know why I'm saying this, if by leaving this in statute and mothballing it, but leaving it in statute, that means that it is easier for districts who want to start a new TIF to come in and just have us notwithstand the language, which as we, for better or for worse, always allow.
Yeah, we basically make a legislative path for approval of new TIF districts. Do you guys mind if I run, or do you have?
Thank you, John, very much for the many, many things you were doing today and yesterday and tomorrow.
Goodbye.
So folks, we have like 7 minutes for a conversation, and we have a lot more time tomorrow. But just what I'm hoping we can do tomorrow before we have a few minutes. And I'm sorry we did not have more time with this bill, but that is not mine. So I'm hoping that folks can digest all that we heard today, both suggestions for amendments that we heard this morning, some of what I'm putting on the table this afternoon, and any of your own ideas, and come tomorrow with all of that ready and written down, whoever works for you. As you know, John is incredibly busy, including staffing a committee of conference in addition to all the bills that he still is moving. So you are welcome to write down your amendment idea or type your amendment idea and not have it formally drafted. We can work it out amongst ourselves before we ask him to do drafting. We also have a couple bills that we have to move tomorrow morning. And they are some of that, what's on the paper printed agenda, people is already not, they are what are the two that are tomorrow?
S63 and S109.
So we're gonna do S63 and S109 tomorrow. They have fairly limited revenue implications. For instance, S109 has those domestic, the marriage license fees that we've seen like 15 times. I really hope we don't need to spend more than 15 seconds on that.
2 minutes.
So if folks can check S63 and S109 tonight or tomorrow morning before we get together, so we can do that efficiently, that would be great. So we can spend way more time on this bill. And I think those were all the public service announcements I wanted to make. What do people want to say in the next 7 minutes we have in front of us? I'm gonna see if someone other than you members of the voting wants to say anything.
Yeah, to talk.
I know. Yeah.
Huge amount of information today, and I will review it tonight. I really need to. I still, and you guys can just ignore me if nobody agrees with me, just forget it.
Say what you need to say.
Yeah, fine. I've got leftover Janet Ansell all over me here. And it's on the yes, it is, I worked with her for like 15 years. It's the ed fund is supposed to be for paying for our children in school. Safe, well done, good teachers who are well paid and cared for too. And if we start,
And so, given that,
Yeah.
thank you for saying that. While this bill has been to a lot of committees already, it is landing here so that we can really attend to the ed fund with it. That is why it is here, and that's what we're doing.
and for whatever it's worth, I did hound people down in the governor's office to find out at length that the governor did in fact suggest this. So,
Indeed, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
he did.
Yes,
So there's that too.
yes.
Those of you who are.
I wonder if Representative Brannigan has any Jim Candon.
Oh, yeah.
left in there because he hated current use.
I know, and I don't hate current use, but I hate it from the ed fund. I mean, we can't be paying for everything that needs money out of the ed fund.
Okay, I'm gonna, yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Representative Wozniak.
Kind of on that point, also reservations about, any more pressures on the ed fund. So I appreciate the proposal in the amendment of somewhat limiting the potential impacts to the ed fund. It's a very complicated, I think, solution, but so I think that might need some more finessing, but I think that we're trying to, if we acknowledge the premise that we're going to do something like this, I think the idea of limiting how much exposure on the ed fund there's going to be is positive step, albeit complicated.
I agree.
Yeah, to touch on Representative Wozniak's point about complicated structure for this cap, I'll have to think about this tonight. I'm trying to understand how a project with such a long runway that is hoping to have CHIP in its capital stack, and there's caps on it, and they have to figure out all these different steps to figure out what their increment would potentially be, and then figure out if it would fit amongst all the other projects that may or may not get approved, or it does. Like, what is that runway, and is it going to be an effective tool in people's capital stacks, just given how early they need to know whether that funding is there or not? So I'm struggling with that a little bit in the way that cap is structured.
So I would offer, one, the increment needs to be approved as part of the application to BEPC, and so that's already sort of implicit in it. But the second piece, we could say it's a limit per year of approvals instead of a limit 5 years, and that way there would be less of a rush to the.
Yeah, I mean, that was my point, is
Yeah.
it just getting to the BEPC
Mhm.
part.
Yeah.
I have Samantha Sheehan's, nice little graphic in mind about all the steps that you need to get to that in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to go through to get to someplace and then say, oh, there's no more money.
Right. Yep. Representative Higley.
Yeah, I agree with Representative Brannigan that there's an awful lot of information here. And I mean, I heard at least two folks talk about how a cap would be detrimental. If I heard them right, and we're looking at a possible cap. My reading of the cap at $190 million is about 13.5 cents on the tax rate to get to that overall. That would be overall. And again, I certainly want to hear what folks have to say about some of the purpose statements. I mean, I have a concern that if we're looking at this for infrastructure and housing, I don't want to have it go to a school construction project that, I mean, to me, we're already paying for Burlington and so many others in our small rural areas. And, even in the construct of what we're looking at here, and I think you mentioned it, Carolyn, too, that the Essex County districts have a lot less ability to, and maybe rightly so. I mean, but I just want to think about that, I guess.
Representative Feltus.
The only other thing that we haven't already talked about that I had wanted to hear about today is, again, the concept of the retention and the percentage of the retention. And I appreciate the work from Mr. Donnelly in terms of what if we said only 60% or only 50% in terms of retention? It would guard the retention amount from the ed fund, that's for sure. But, is it too small to be a viable part of the capital stack that would then cause projects not to go?
And both Pat's models that he's built to work with us on this and Chris's spreadsheets, both you can sort of toggle those percentages if you want to do some fun work tonight. Yeah. I'm gonna go to Representatives Holcomb and Odie in whatever order you would like.
I'm just going to offer an observation. I'm struggling to understand the coherence of the policy that we're working across the board this session, because this particular initiative seems to be very different in its theory of action than the education work. And I'm trying to figure out why those two proposals came out of the same administration, just to be blunt, because they seem like they're working across the system. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks. Representative Bodie?
I was hoping we could think about this. If we have new school district lines drawn and we have a cap on what will allow in this program, how will that impact the ability of places with who need to have grand list growth to help them with supplemental district spending? How will that impact that? And as a matter of fact, one more thing, which is today, and I'd be totally wrong about this, but today, if you don't feel like having grand list growth in your town, you don't have to. You can benefit from the grand list growth of the whole state of others. And if we cap this, does it make it just harder for you to grow your grand list? And then if you wanted to do projects, harder to grow your grand list, and then harder for you to be able to be a contributor when you need to artificially depress grand lists in certain areas, and then it gives us less capacity to help each other out with this the supplemental district spending.
Give us anything.
No, I was saying, I guess I worry about a tool that gets so complicated that nobody uses it. So,
Yeah.
so I want to take a look at that. Sometime with it.
And some of the amendments that I asked John to make were actually just places that new definitions had been created that were fairly close to existing statutory definitions, and just like, but I think more of that is needed. I think everyone. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'll see you tomorrow.